questions about the environmental concerns that rose in the latter part of the 20th century. All right, let's turn to something completely different then, still in culture and society. Although, I could take the easy joke about blowing hot air to transition from environmentalism to televangelism, but I'm going to take that. I'm going to take that easy way out. But televangelism also represents this question of how do you relate to the culture around you, right? How do you relate to the technology that is at your fingertips? Well, as technology developed in the 20th century, not surprisingly, ministers and churches continue to find new ways to use that technology to spread the message. I mean, that's been the continual thing here since the invention of the printing press, right? And once the printing press, you start printing religious documents, right? Once technology increases, you continue to print religious documents. Some technology was more successful than others. With the creation of television, many preachers attempted to get on television to provide religious broadcasting. Sometimes it was just the church broadcasting their worship services. Sometimes it might just be a preacher delivering a sermon. Some of these ministers and their ministries became quite famous, almost celebrities. At some point, someone, and it's really kind of unclear, coined the term televangelist to describe these celebrity ministers, right? Television evangelist, televangelist. But who did it the first time, nobody really knows. But that's what these people would start to be called. And often the term televangelist was meant to be pejorative. It wasn't really a positive term. Largely because a lot of these celebrity ministers often would appeal for financial contributions from their TV audiences. Many of the most successful ministers, televangelists, also claimed healing powers, either for those who came to their services. Right? So you come to my service and we'll have a healing session and bring up all these people. Some even claimed remote healing, right? That they could heal people remotely. Right? You're sitting in your living room watching TV, right? We can heal you there if you have the faith. I mentioned a couple of rather prominent ones. Jimmy Swaggart, born in the 1930s, largely Pentecostal. Many televangelists, those that are the celebrity ones, tend to be Pentecostal or charismatic. We'll talk more about Pentecostalism in another class, probably on Thursday. Eventually he would start a television ministry, but he was also a musician. He was actually the cousin of rock and roll musician Jerry Lee Lewis, who was famous for the song Great Balls of Fire. Another important televangelist at the time was Jerry Falwell, who we mentioned previously when talking about politics. Falwell was a Baptist. He had started preaching in Lynchburg, Virginia, started a radio and then a television ministry, would also go on to found a college, which is now Liberty University. Largely, Falwell was a fundamentalist, very separatist, right? They retreat from society, segregationist as well, so tried to keep blacks and whites separate. Largely, he was apolitical until the 1970s, and we talked a little bit about that, about him preaching that sermon of ministers and marches that said ministers should stay in the pulpit, but eventually would be responsible for the creation of the moral majority. Another prominent one, still active, is Pat Robertson, not as active as the previous years because of his age. Robertson was educated at Yale Law School, later would go into the ministry. He grew up Baptist, but became charismatic in the 1950s. In 1960, he purchased a television station and started the Christian Broadcasting Network. The key program for the network was the 700 Club, which is still around. Essentially, the idea behind the 700 Club was they were looking for 700 members to donate $10 a month. that would help keep the network on the air. He too would expand the television ministry and later start a university, Regent University, which is also in Virginia. He would go on to rename the channel the Family Channel, and the 700 Club was still important, broadcast twice a day. The Family Channel would include family movies, other types of family programming, Christian programming as well. Eventually, Robertson has to sell the television network, the channel, because it becomes too successful, that the ministry is in danger of being not nonprofit, right? It's a nonprofit ministry, but here is this booming family channel, and so he has to sell that off so he can maintain his nonprofit status. He sold it to Rupert Murdoch for $200 million, with the requirement that the 700 Club would still be broadcast twice a day. Murdoch renamed it the Fox Family Channel, and the condition to broadcast the 700 Club remained in force even when it was sold to Disney, who rebranded it as ABC Family. And then ABC is just, it's rebranding it now. I can't remember what the new channel is supposed to be called.
Yeah, I remember it's in January it changed the name.
Yeah.
But it's meant to be like millennials.
Yeah. It's like the family is being completely dropped from the name. And if you see, yeah. But as far as I know, the 700 Club is still on, and I would assume that it probably still will be broadcast even in this new format. But if you ever happen to catch the beginning of the 700 Club, there is always that title card disclaimer of this broadcast does not reflect the views of ABC Family. All right, and so there's, you gotta air it because it's in the contract of the selling, but just attempting to distance it. One of the last ones to mention is Jim Baker. His ministry was called PTL, or Praise the Lord. His wife was Tammy Faye Baker. Wore a lot of makeup, big hair. I remember watching the PTL Club during my childhood. Every so often, Grandma would have it on for some reason. Church of Christ. I don't know why we were watching PTL, but.
Like sultry or Christian.
Yeah. He would go on. The Bakers would go on to start a Christian theme park called Heritage USA, which is now defunct. I just came across an article. I'd say it was late summer about. I mean, all the buildings are just kind of there, but things are starting to get overgrown and everything, and it's just real kind of a ghost town right now. And there's developers trying to gain control of it because you can put them all there or whatever. The Heritage USA was popular for a while, and actually when the PTL Club went defunct, because of some things we'll talk about here in a minute, Falwell bought it, but then ended up not being able to do anything with it, and so it just kind of fell away. Largely because of a variety of scandals. Right? That was the big thing in the 1980s that brought down several of these individuals, Baker and Swaggart especially, and others that we haven't mentioned. There were a lot of scandals associated with television, televangelism throughout the 80s. Some had to do with the amount of money coming into these ministries. There were accusations of financial misdealings, tax evasion, money laundering, all of these kind of things. Often there were tensions between televangelists, with televangelists attempting to frame other televangelists or bring their ministries down. There were even a variety of sexual indiscretions, people caught in affairs, like Jimmy Swaggart, caught with a prostitute. And one of the images that again, from the 1980s is Swaggart, after being caught with a prostitute, is addressing his congregation. He's weeping terribly, his tears streaming down his face, talking about how he had sinned, and the ministry took a hit for a while. He stepped away, then came back, then got involved in another scandal with a prostitute, and so there are a variety but it was on the television, on the news, quite frequently there for that time period. And so, televangelism always has that kind of negative connotation to it because of the scandals, because of the asking for money. All of that has always been a part of that, and even to today, televangelism is still around. You scroll through the networks, you're going to find a televangelism, usually like late at night, because that's when they'll be willing to sell broadcast time to televangelists. Questions, comments about televangelism?
What's the correlation of TVN with the Christian broadcasting?
It's completely separate. That was started by Paul and Jane Crouch. TVN is more out of the what's known as the Word of Faith movement, which is, you might have prosperity gospel, health and wealth gospel, name it and claim it. This idea that if you have faith, you can positively state what God's going to do for you, and God's going to bring you material blessings, right? So it's somewhat different than the Christian Broadcasting Network. Baker was kind of along that way, the kind of name it and claim it. Joel Osteen would be part of that today too, prosperity gospel. Other questions? Let's turn then to talking about different doctrinal developments in the 20th century. One of those to really focus on is the development of fundamentalism. In the 19th century, as liberal Protestants adopted higher criticism, accepted Darwinism, they began to develop and modify and adapt Christian doctrine to these developments. Others responded negatively to these ideologies, ultimately becoming a group of people known as fundamentalists. Now today, we use the term fundamentalism to apply to a variety of religious groups. And so we can talk about Islamic fundamentalism, we can talk about Hindu fundamentalism, there's Jewish fundamentalism. The use of this term reflects a sociological reality of how conservative groups that we might label fundamentalists share some similar characteristics. Most fundamentalist groups start out as resistance movements. Now, what that means is that they see something changing in their culture, and they're responding to it. Right? Fundamentalist groups don't start off as a group that's, I'm trying to find a way to say it. I want to say like a positively themed group, but the word positive might not throw it off. They don't start just out of the blue. They start in resistance to or in response to something else. Right? And so in this case, 20th century fundamentalism started as a resistance to adaptation to modern culture. Right? Islamic fundamentalism started as resistance to the encroaching of Western ideology, the secularization of Muslim countries. Right? So there's that resistance aspect. Secondly, fundamentalist groups often look back to a traditional religious culture, to a time period where they believed everybody thought the way that they thought. So that, for Christian fundamentalists in the United States, looking back to the founding as, the founding of a Christian nation. For Muslim fundamentalists, looking back to a time period where, shortly after the life of Muhammad, the rightly guided caliphate, there was that 7th, 8th century where people were divinely guided by Sharia law. And so looking back to that traditional past. So you're resisting culture and modern culture and developments. You're looking back through traditional past, and what you see is that what should have been yours is now gone. You are the heirs of the founders, the heirs of the origins of your nation, your country. You have lost that. You're dispossessed from that inheritance because culture is moving away from you. Fundamentalist groups also tend to have inerrant sources of authority that are to be unquestioned. Most fundamentalist groups also tend to be separatist in outlook. Right? They want to separate from society. It's not just about maintaining your identity within society. It's walling yourself off from these outside forces. And finally, although fundamentalists tend to reject a lot of modern culture, they tend to also embrace modern technology. So, for example, when ISIS wanted to claim responsibility for the Paris attacks, it took to Twitter. And they released a video announcing that DC, they said, would be next. And so there's this rejection of modern culture, but the embrace of modern technology. There's new ways to get that old message out.